My son and my ex-wife left me stranded at a foreign airport with $12 in my pocket, and when they walked away from me at Charles de Gaulle Airport, laughing as they handed their first-class boarding passes to the gate agent, they thought they were leaving behind a weak man, a failed father, a broke ex-husband who finally understood his place in their lives. But what they did not know was that a private detective was standing less than 30 feet away recording every word. What they did not know was that my 94-year-old grandfather, Harold Wilson, had been watching their cruelty for months through reports, audio files, photographs, and witness statements. And what they definitely did not know was that the moment they publicly abandoned me in Paris, they triggered an inheritance clause that would remove them from a $340 million family empire forever. My name is Charles Wilson, and for most of my adult life, I had been trained by the people closest to me to apologize for existing. Not directly at first, because people like Margaret rarely begin with open cruelty. They begin with correction. They adjust your collar in public and sigh like you have embarrassed them. They tell you your shirt is fine, but not for this restaurant. They say your car is reliable in the same tone someone might use to describe a dog that has grown too old to hunt. They smile in front of others while cutting you in half with a sentence only you can hear. By the time our marriage ended, Margaret had already made me smaller in every room we entered. And after the divorce, she perfected that talent into something almost elegant. She did not simply insult me. She created an atmosphere in which everyone understood I was less successful, less refined, less useful, less worthy of being considered family, unless I performed gratitude for whatever small place she allowed me to occupy. Daniel, our son, learned that language from her slowly, then fluently. When he was a child, he used to run into my arms when I came home from work, smelling like grass and laundry detergent, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, his questions falling over each other faster than I could answer. When he was 12, he still wanted me in the bleachers at his baseball game. When he was 17, he stopped hugging me unless someone was watching. When he was 23, he stopped calling me dad. It did not happen with an announcement. There was no final conversation, no dramatic break. He simply began introducing me as Charles. At first, I thought it was a phase, the kind of careless distance young adults sometimes adopt when they are trying too hard to sound independent. Then I heard the difference in his voice. Charles was not a name. It was a demotion. It placed me outside the circle. It turned fatherhood into a biological accident. At family gatherings, he would say, "This is Charles," and then glance toward Margaret as if waiting for approval. And Margaret would give him that small, satisfied smile she always wore when someone else did her cruelty for her. For 3 years after the divorce, they did not just drift away from me. They trained me to accept that I deserved the distance. Margaret lived in a 4-bedroom house in one of those suburbs where the lawns looked professionally trimmed even when no one admitted hiring help, where the mailboxes matched, where neighbors noticed if a car stayed parked too long on the street. She drove a Mercedes GLE 450, and mentioned the lease payment often enough that I could recite it without thinking. $890 a month. She wore clothes that looked effortless, but cost enough to make effort unnecessary. She had a boyfriend named Richard who owned 3 businesses, a house in the Hamptons, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to explain a declined car. I lived in a 450-square-foot studio apartment above a dry cleaner, paid $1,200 a month in rent, drove a silver 2018 Toyota Camry with 89,000 miles on it, and bought most of my shirts from Target because they were clean, simple, and lasted long enough if you washed them carefully. Margaret made those facts feel like moral failures. "I don't understand how you can show up places looking like that," she would say, her eyes moving over me with quiet disgust. "Don't you have any pride?" I used to answer honestly. I used to say, "It's clean." I used to say, "It fits." I used to say, "I'm not trying to impress anyone." But eventually I learned that honesty was not a defense. It only gave her more material. The humiliation that changed everything happened 6 months before Paris, at a restaurant Margaret insisted we attend, for Daniel's sake. A phrase she used whenever she wanted me to participate in my own degradation without complaint. It was one of those restaurants where the lighting was low enough to make everyone look wealthy, and the menu had no dollar signs, because the prices were supposed to feel like a private understanding among people who did not need to ask. Daniel sat across from me with AirPods in, scrolling through his phone while I tried to ask him about work, about friends, about anything that might become a conversation. His answers came without eye contact. Yeah, fine. Not really. Margaret ordered a $40 bottle of wine with the casual authority of someone making a point. I remember watching the waiter pour it, seeing Daniel glance at the label, seeing Margaret look at me just long enough to make sure I understood. Halfway through dinner I said, "Daniel, can we talk for a minute?" "Just us." He did not look up. "About what?" "About us," I said. "About being father and son." That made him look up, but not at me. He looked at Margaret first, like a child still checking which answer would be rewarded. "Mom," he said, his voice bored and irritated, "do I have to deal with this?" Margaret lifted her glass and took a slow sip before answering. "Charles," she said, "he's an adult. He doesn't owe you a relationship." I felt the sentence land, but tried not to show it. "I'm his father." Daniel leaned back then, finally looking at me directly, and there was something in his face I had not seen clearly before because I had been too busy hoping. Contempt, not anger, not confusion, not hurt. Contempt. "Are you?" he asked. "Because fathers usually provide things. They support their families. They help their kids move forward. You can't even afford your own plane ticket." The restaurant seemed to quiet around us. Or maybe I only imagined it because humiliation has a way of sharpening every nearby sound. A fork touching porcelain, a woman laughing at another table, ice shifting in a glass. "I've supported myself just fine," I said. Margaret laughed softly, not loudly enough to seem cruel to strangers, but loud enough for me. "Have you? Charles, you live in a studio apartment. You shop at Target. You drive a car with almost 90,000 miles on it. Those things don't define me. They define everything," Daniel said, and this time his voice carried. "Mom's boyfriend has a house in the Hamptons. He's taking us to Europe next month first class. You've never taken me anywhere first class. You've never taken me anywhere, period." I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to tell him about the years I paid for school supplies, medical bills, baseball equipment. The times I skipped meals after the divorce so I could send money when Margaret said he needed something. But those facts felt small in that room. They sounded like excuses before I even opened my mouth. Margaret leaned forward, her smile gentle in the way a knife can be polished. "Daniel, your father can't afford to take you to McDonald's, let alone Europe." The waiter appeared then, young, nervous, sensing tension the way service workers always do before anyone admits it. "Is everything okay here?" he asked. Margaret turned to him with bright politeness. "Everything's fine. We're just explaining to Charles that some people earn their place at the table, and others just show up hoping someone else will pay." I reached for my wallet because I needed something to do with my hands. I pulled out 2 20s, all the cash I had. "This should cover my share," I said. Daniel looked at the bills and laughed, not quietly, not accidentally. $40. Mom's bottle of wine cost more than that." I stood because if I stayed another minute, something inside me was going to break in front of them, and I was not ready to give them that, too. "I'll see you both later," I said. Margaret's voice followed me as I walked out. "Will you, though? Because honestly, Charles, what's the point? You add nothing to these dinners. You add nothing to Daniel's life. You're just there, taking up space." I drove home in my 89,000-mile Camry, parked between a rusted pickup truck and a Honda with a dented bumper, climbed the stairs to my studio apartment, and sat in the dark without turning on the light. For 3 hours, I did not move. I thought about my son. I thought about the way he had looked at me like I was an unpaid bill. I thought about Margaret and how completely she had succeeded in teaching him that respect was something you purchased. And then, for the first time in years, I thought seriously about my grandfather, Harold Wilson. Not because I wanted money. I had spent most of my adult life avoiding any connection to the Wilson fortune, because I had seen what proximity to wealth did to people. Harold built Wilson Steel Industries from nothing, from a single warehouse, borrowed equipment, and a level of discipline that frightened men half his age. By '94, he owned or controlled a $340 million empire, including the steel company, multiple real estate holdings, investment accounts, charitable trusts, and the Wilson Foundation, one of the most influential philanthropic organizations in Pennsylvania. But Harold never lived like other wealthy men. He wore the same style of dark suit every day, ate oatmeal for breakfast, remembered the names of janitors, and could tell whether someone respected him or only respected the room he controlled within 30 seconds of meeting them. He had watched my marriage to Margaret with quiet concern, but he rarely interfered. People reveal themselves when they think the outcome is already decided, he told me once. I did not understand then how carefully he meant it. 2 weeks after the restaurant humiliation, Margaret called me on a Tuesday morning. I was standing in my apartment kitchen, which was really just a counter beside the refrigerator, drinking coffee from a chipped mug and looking out at the parking lot. "Charles," she said, using the tone she reserved for conversations she had already finished in her head, "we need to talk about boundaries." The word made my stomach tight. Boundaries around what? "Daniel," I set the mug down slowly. "What about him? He doesn't want you calling him anymore." I waited for a second, because there are sentences the mind refuses to process until they are repeated internally. "He told you that?" "He told me he's tired of feeling guilty every time your name shows up on his phone. He says it feels like getting a reminder that he's related to failure." Failure. My hand closed around the edge of the counter. I did not speak, because the word had struck some place too deep for immediate response. Margaret filled the silence easily. She always did. "I know that sounds harsh, but I think it's important that we be honest. He's trying to build a life, Charles. He's meeting people who can help him. Richard is talking about helping him start a business. Real money, real connections, real opportunities. And then there's you, calling because you want to feel included. I'm his father. Biologically, yes." The softness of her voice made it worse. "But what are you actually contributing to his life? What value are you adding?" "Love," I said, and even to my own ears it sounded exposed. Margaret sighed almost sadly. "Love is not a business plan. Love does not open doors. Love does not pay rent in the neighborhoods Daniel wants to live in. You keep thinking fatherhood is something you're owed because of history. But Daniel is an adult now. He gets to choose who influences him. And you want him to choose Richard. I want him to choose success." I looked around my apartment then, at the small table by the window, the second-hand couch, the neatly folded laundry in a basket because I had no dresser large enough for everything, and for a moment shame rose so strongly I almost accepted her version of me as fact. That was Margaret's real gift. She did not have to lie completely. She selected facts and arranged them until they became a cage. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying maybe it's time for you to step aside. Stop forcing a relationship that clearly isn't working. Stop making him feel guilty for outgrowing you. And if I don't—" There was a pause, brief but deliberate. "Then we'll have to create harder boundaries, legal ones if necessary." I felt something cold settle beneath my ribs. She was threatening to use lawyers to formalize what she had already done emotionally. She wanted me removed from my son's life, not because I had harmed him, not because I had abandoned him, but because I was poor enough to embarrass them. After she hung up, I sat at the table for a long time, and this time the silence did not feel empty. It felt watched. I did not know yet that it was. Harold had already hired Morrison, a private investigator with a background in corporate security and family trust disputes, to document Margaret and Daniel's behavior. I did not know that the restaurant humiliation had been recorded through witness statements. I did not know that Margaret's call was the final pattern Harold had been waiting to confirm. I did not know that my grandfather had quietly added a codicil to his estate plan 2 years earlier, a character clause tied to abandonment, public humiliation, and conditional family loyalty. I only knew that I was losing my son, and the worst part was that he seemed relieved to be lost. The Paris trip arrived disguised as opportunity. Margaret called in September, voice bright in the way it became when she had already calculated the advantage of sounding generous. "Daniel and I are going to Paris for a long weekend," she said. "There's a business conference there. Networking, investors, family leadership panels, that kind of thing. It could be very good for him." "That's great," I said, because even after everything, I still wanted good things for my son. The organizers requested attendees bring family members. Something about authenticity, legacy, generational support. "Richard can't make it that weekend." I waited, knowing now there was always a turn. "So you want me to come?" "I want you to come and act like a normal father for 3 days. Can you do that?" I should have said no. Even now, I can see the warning signs clearly. Margaret had not included me voluntarily in years. Daniel barely answered my messages. A trip to Paris did not fit the pattern unless there was something to be gained from my presence or from my failure. But hope is not intelligent. Hope does not study evidence. Hope sees one door cracked open after years of locked rooms and calls it a chance. "I'll pay my own way," I said. Margaret laughed once. "Charles, you can't afford your own way. I can use my credit card." "Fine. If pretending matters that much to you, use your credit card. The conference is covering accommodations for family members. Just get yourself there and try not to make things awkward." The flight cost $1,147, almost my monthly rent. I put it on a card with an interest rate that should have embarrassed me more than it did. But I told myself it was for Daniel. I told myself fathers take risks. Fathers show up. Fathers endure discomfort if there is even a small chance of saving something. When I arrived at Charles de Gaulle on October 12th, jet-lagged and carrying a black duffel bag from Walmart, I found Margaret and Daniel in the Air France arrival area looking as though they had been placed there by a luxury travel advertisement. Margaret wore a cream designer suit, sunglasses resting in her hair, a handbag I recognized from an article as costing more than my car payment for half a year. Daniel wore a fitted jacket, white sneakers too clean for real walking, and AirPods in both ears. Beside them stood two matching Louis Vuitton suitcases, brown monogrammed, polished, expensive enough to declare their owners before anyone spoke. Margaret saw me first. Her smile flickered, then corrected itself. "Charles, you made it." Daniel looked up, his eyes moving over my polo shirt, khaki pants, and older sneakers. For a second, something like discomfort crossed his face, but it disappeared quickly. "Dad," he said, but the word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, like he was testing whether anyone nearby would notice. I held on to it anyway. That was how desperate I was. "Good to see you," I said. He nodded, already looking back at his phone. The first public cut came at baggage claim, when my duffel slid onto the carousel beside their designer luggage. Margaret looked at it as if it had made a noise. "Jesus, Charles," she muttered. "Could you try to look like you belong somewhere nice? It's just a bag." Daniel pulled one AirPod out. "It's never just anything with you. It's always just a bag, just a shirt, just a car, just poverty." The word hung there, ugly and casual. Poverty. A businessman standing nearby glanced over, then away. I felt my face heat, but said nothing. Silence had become my last defense, though Margaret had taught them both to treat it as proof of guilt. We took a taxi to the Ritz-Carlton, Paris, and the ride through the city should have felt magical, should have been the kind of memory people save. But I spent most of it pressed against the door while Margaret and Daniel discussed dinner reservations, business contacts, and whether Richard's assistant had confirmed something about a tea gallery tour. Every few minutes Margaret would glance at me and say something like, "Try not to speak too much at the conference unless someone asks you directly," or, "The people here are very accomplished, Charles, and they can sense insecurity." Daniel laughed softly at that. I pretended to look out the window. The hotel suite was on the 12th floor, room 1205, and it was larger than my entire apartment, with high ceilings, fresh flowers, marble surfaces, and a view of Paris that made my throat tighten despite everything. "How are you paying for this?" I asked before I could stop myself. Margaret placed her handbag on a chair and turned slowly. "That is not your concern. Your concern is acting like you deserve to be here." The conference began that afternoon in a ballroom filled with people who spoke in polished sentences about capital, legacy, succession, influence, and opportunity. Daniel transformed when he entered the room. He smiled easily, shook hands firmly, repeated phrases he had clearly practiced, and introduced Margaret with pride. When he introduced me, there was always a hesitation. "This is Charles," he would say, then add, if the silence required it, "my father." Margaret corrected the space around that word each time. "Charles is more of an observer," she told one investor after I tried to comment on a panel about family businesses. "He's not involved in any active enterprise." Another time, when someone asked what I did, she answered before I could. "He's between things right now." I had worked steadily my entire life, not glamorously, not in executive offices, but steadily. Logistics, operations, consulting contracts. Practical work that paid bills until the divorce and legal fees narrowed my life into survival. But in that ballroom, Margaret made me sound like a man who had misplaced ambition and never found it again. At dinner that night, Daniel asked an investor named Paul about seed funding. And when Paul turned politely to me and asked whether entrepreneurship ran in the family, Margaret laughed and touched his arm. "Not exactly. Daniel gets his drive from my side." Everyone smiled because they thought it was harmless. I smiled too, because I had learned to do that when bleeding quietly. The second day was worse, because by then I understood my role. I was not there to reconnect with my son. I was there to be displayed as contrast. Margaret wanted Daniel to appear ambitious despite me, elevated beyond me, proof that he had escaped some inherited smallness. Every time I reached for a conversation, she redirected it. Every time Daniel seemed almost willing to include me, She interrupted with a correction. At breakfast, she moved my seat 2 chairs away from him because she said investors needed easier access. During a networking break, she told me my tie was crooked, then fixed it with a smile sharp enough to draw blood, whispering, "You look terrified. Please stop looking terrified." At lunch, Daniel complained that I had asked too many basic questions during a panel, and Margaret said, "He doesn't know better." That's the problem. They did not shout. They did not need to. Public humiliation is more effective when performed with social polish. People around us sensed tension, but saw only a wealthy woman managing an awkward ex-husband, a successful son embarrassed by a father who did not fit. The final day, October 14th, began with rain tapping softly against the hotel windows. I remember that detail because I woke early, before sunrise, and stood by the window watching the city blur beneath gray light. I told myself I could endure one more day. I told myself I had made it this far. I told myself Daniel had said Dad once at the airport, and maybe that meant something. Hope kept shrinking, but I kept holding the smaller version. At lunch, Margaret placed 3 boarding passes on the table. Hers and Daniel's were first class for that evening. Mine was not there. "Change of plans," she said. Daniel kept scrolling on his phone. "What about mine?" I asked. "Your flight is tomorrow." "Tomorrow, coach." "Red eye." "Middle seat, I believe." I looked from her to Daniel. "Why?" Margaret folded her napkin with careful precision. "Daniel and I need to get back early. We have important plans tomorrow night." "What plans?" Daniel looked up then. "The kind that don't include you." I waited for Margaret to correct him. She did not. She only watched me, almost curious, as if studying how long it would take me to understand. "I don't have money for an extra night in this hotel," I said. Margaret's expression did not change. "That sounds like a you problem. You invited me here, and you came. Adults are responsible for themselves. You told me accommodations were covered." "They were," she said, "until the conference ended." Daniel put his phone down and leaned forward, his face carrying the impatience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "Charles, this whole thing has been painful. You don't fit with these people. You don't understand the conversations. You make everyone uncomfortable. Mom and I have been carrying you for 3 days. Carrying me? Emotionally," Margaret said. "Socially. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to constantly manage your awkwardness?" I looked at Daniel. "Is that what you think?" For the first time, he looked almost uncomfortable, but Margaret's eyes moved to him, and the discomfort hardened into performance. "Yes," he said, "you make everything harder." Something inside me went quiet. Not numb exactly, more like a door closing softly in a distant room. "So you're leaving me here. We're giving you time to figure out how to get home on your own," Daniel said. "Like an adult." I had $12 in cash, one nearly maxed-out credit card, and no room for the night. They knew that. They had to know that. The cruelty was not accidental. It was the point. An hour later, I found them at gate 42 preparing to board. I do not know why I went there. Maybe some part of me still believed shame worked both ways, that if I confronted them in public, they would remember I was human. Margaret saw me approaching and straightened, almost pleased. "Please don't do this," I said. My voice was lower than I expected. "Do what?" Margaret said loudly, turning enough for the people nearby to hear. "Ask you to take responsibility for yourself for once." Several passengers looked over. Daniel removed one AirPod and sighed. "We talked about this. I'm your family." His face changed then, not with anger, but with disgust. "Are you?" "Because family supports each other. Family contributes something. You don't." Margaret stepped closer, speaking clearly, projecting just enough. "You are not our responsibility anymore, Charles. Good luck getting home without money." A woman seated near the window looked up sharply. A man in a navy blazer frowned. The gate agent froze with a boarding pass in her hand. Daniel added, "Maybe this will teach you to plan better." Then they turned away from me. Margaret handed over her boarding pass first. Daniel followed, and neither looked back as they walked down the jet bridge. I stood there while strangers watched, some embarrassed for me, some pitying, some relieved it was not their family being exposed. Through the glass, I saw the plane waiting under the gray Paris sky. I watched until the jet bridge door closed. Then I took out my phone and made one call. Patricia Stevens answered on the second ring. She had been the Wilson family attorney for 25 years, and there was no surprise in her voice when she heard mine. "Charles," I watched the aircraft begin to push back from the gate. "It's time to execute the codicil." There was a silence, not because she was shocked, but because final things deserve a pause. "Are you certain? They left me stranded in a foreign country with $12. Was Morrison present?" I looked across the terminal and saw a man in a dark coat near the VIP lounge lower his phone slightly. I had noticed him before without understanding why. "Yes," I said. "He recorded everything." Patricia exhaled softly. "Then we proceed. I need you to understand this is irreversible once filed." "They made it irreversible first," I heard typing on her end. "Your grandfather will want the details personally. He'll have them." "He already does," she said quietly. That was the first moment. I understood the scale of what had been happening behind the scenes. "How long?" I asked. 6 months of active documentation, 2 years of estate planning revisions. Harold suspected Margaret would eventually create a moment clear enough to remove any ambiguity. He believed she would expose herself if she thought no one important was watching. I looked at the plane through the glass as it turned toward the runway. She thought no one important was watching me. Exactly. Patricia's voice became brisk now, legal, procedural. The original estate plan assigned $51 million, split between Margaret and Daniel through family trust provisions and direct bequests. The amended codicil removes them entirely upon documented abandonment, public humiliation, or coercive severance of family relationship for financial or status-based reasons. Their conduct today appears to satisfy all triggers. Morrison's footage confirms it. Witnesses are being identified. The filing will happen tomorrow morning Paris time. And then you become sole heir to the Wilson estate and designated successor chairman of the Wilson Foundation. Margaret's home is financed through a Wilson family trust. That funding terminates. Daniel's lifestyle trust freezes. Any credit facilities tied to the estate close. Vehicles, accounts, housing, all reviewed and withdrawn where legally permitted. The plane accelerated down the runway. I watched it lift into the sky, carrying my ex-wife and my son away from the man they thought they had finished. When do they find out? Patricia paused again. Harold wants to tell them at the Wilson Foundation Gala Saturday night. I closed my eyes. The gala. 500 of Pittsburgh's most influential people in one ballroom. Business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, the exact circle Margaret had spent 3 years trying to enter fully. He's going to do it publicly. He believes public cruelty warrants public correction. The line went quiet except for her typing. "Charles, I know this is difficult." I almost laughed because difficult was too small a word. "No," I said. Difficult was standing at that gate, while my son told strangers I was worthless. This is something else. Getting home could have been easy once Patricia wired money, but I did not go home immediately. Instead, I booked a €60 hotel near the airport. A narrow room with thin walls, a hard mattress, and a window overlooking a service road. I could have returned to the Ritz. Patricia offered to arrange it. Harold would have paid without hesitation, but I needed one night in a place that matched who I had been that morning. Because by the next day, the legal reality of my life would change so violently that I did not trust myself to understand it all at once. I sat on the edge of the bed with my duffel bag by my feet and replayed everything. Margaret's voice at the gate, Daniel's face, the way he said, "You're not our responsibility anymore." I tried to hate him cleanly, but grief kept interfering. A son does not become cruel in one moment. Cruelty has roots. Margaret had watered them, but I had missed them growing. That night, I did not sleep. The next evening, Daniel called. His name on the screen still had a photo from years earlier, taken when he was 18. Sunburned and smiling after a summer baseball game. I let it ring twice before answering. "Charles," he said, "not Dad now. We need to talk." "About what?" "About what happened at the airport. Mom thinks maybe we were too harsh." The phrasing was so absurd that I looked around the little room as if someone else might have heard it. "Too harsh? People say things when they're stressed," he said. "We were all under pressure. You boarded first class and left me without a hotel. Can we not dramatize it?" There it was, the pivot. Harm becomes drama when the person who caused it wants distance from the consequences. "What do you want?" I asked. "Meet us tomorrow at the hotel. Noon. Lobby. Mom wants to clear the air." "Why?" "Because we're family," he said, and the words sounded borrowed. I almost told him then. I almost said, "You should have remembered that yesterday." But I did not. Some consequences require silence before they arrive. "I'll be there," I said. The next day, Margaret and Daniel sat in the Ritz lobby beneath chandeliers and carved ceilings, positioned where people could see them. And I understood immediately that this was not an apology. It was a second performance. Margaret wore a navy designer dress and a diamond bracelet Richard had probably bought. Daniel had his AirPods in again, one removed, one still lodged in his ear like a signal that I did not deserve his full attention. "Charles," Margaret said warmly as I approached. Too warmly. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from them. "You wanted to clear the air?" "Yes," she said. "I want you to understand that yesterday was not personal. Leaving me stranded wasn't personal. It was practical," Daniel said. "We had commitments. More important than making sure your father got home safely." Margaret's smile tightened. "Let's not use emotional language to manipulate the conversation." I stared at her. Emotional language? Yes. Father, abandoned, stranded. Those words are loaded, Charles. What happened was that you failed to plan responsibly and became upset when we refused to rescue you from your own limitations. I looked at Daniel, waiting, still waiting. God help me for him to object. He did not. "Mom is right," he said. "You always make your problems someone else's guilt." "And what am I to you now?" I asked. Margaret leaned back slightly, as if relieved I had given her the doorway she wanted. "A biological connection," she said. "That's all." The lobby around us seemed to sharpen. A couple at a nearby table stopped speaking. A man with a newspaper lowered it slightly. The concierge looked up. Margaret knew she wanted witnesses again. She believed witnesses made her powerful because she did not know whose witnesses they were. "Daniel has real mentors now," she continued. "People with resources, people who can guide his career. Richard has already introduced him to investors." "Richard," I said. "Your boyfriend?" "Fiancé," she corrected. "He proposed last month." "Congratulations," Daniel laughed softly. "You don't sound happy. You sound bitter." "I'm not bitter." Margaret's eyes hardened. "You should be embarrassed, not bitter. Look around you, Charles. This is success. This is what happens when people make something of themselves. And then there is you, sitting here in bargain clothes, expecting emotional credit for doing nothing. I worked my entire life. And what did it produce?" she asked. "A studio apartment and a used Toyota." Daniel leaned forward. "Do you know what it feels like to be your son? To have people ask what my father does and know there is no impressive answer?" I felt the words more deeply than I wanted to. "I didn't know you were ashamed of me." "That's because you never listen," he said. "You only want to be loved for existing." Margaret nodded, pleased. "Exactly. You want unconditional love because you cannot earn conditional respect." The couple nearby had stopped pretending. The businessman's newspaper was folded now. The lobby had entered that strange collective stillness that forms when strangers witness something too intimate to interrupt. "So this is goodbye," Daniel said. "For real this time. No more calls. No more guilt. No more forced dinners. No more pretending. You're cutting me off completely." "We're choosing people who add value to our lives," Margaret said. "People who bring something to the table. And I bring nothing." She did not hesitate. "Nothing." I stood. I had imagined this moment might break me. Instead, it emptied me. "I understand," I said. Margaret watched carefully, perhaps disappointed I had not begged. "Do you?" "Because I want to be very clear. This is permanent." "Yes," I said. "It is." I walked out of the lobby without looking back. Behind me, I heard Margaret say to Daniel, "That went better than I expected." Daniel replied, "Maybe now we can finally move on." They had no idea Harold Wilson was upstairs in the presidential suite with Morrison's footage already playing on a private screen. They had no idea Patricia had filed the amended documents that morning. They had no idea that in less than 24 hours, the same social circle they were performing for would watch their entire constructed lives collapse in real time. Saturday evening, I arrived at the Ritz wearing a Tom Ford tuxedo Patricia had arranged. And the man in the mirror looked unfamiliar. Not because of the clothes, but because I was no longer trying to disappear inside them. Patricia met me in the lobby, carrying a leather briefcase. "Everything is filed," she said quietly. "As of noon Paris time, you are the sole heir. And they're here, upstairs getting ready. They believe tonight is another networking opportunity." "Does Harold know about the lobby conversation?" Patricia's expression tight. "He watched the recording 3 times. He has not spoken much since." We took the elevator to the presidential suite. Harold stood by the window overlooking Paris, tall despite his age, his silver hair combed back, his cane resting beside him rather than supporting him. At 94, he had the stillness of a man who did not waste movement. When he turned, his eyes studied me with such directness that for a moment I felt like a child again. "Tell me exactly what they said," he said. I did. I repeated the airport, the gate, the lobby, the biological connection. The claim that I brought nothing to the table, the permanent goodbye. Harold listened without interruption. Only once did his expression change. When I repeated Daniel saying that family meant contributing something, his jaw tightened then, not dramatically, but enough. I misunderstood that boy for 26 years, he said. No, I said quietly. I did. Harold looked at me for a long moment. A father always blames himself first. That is why betrayal by a child cuts deeper than betrayal by anyone else. Patricia opened her briefcase and placed documents on the desk. The foundation board is ready. The board meeting took 15 minutes. 12 respected business leaders, people whose names appeared on hospitals, university buildings, museum wings, and campaign donor lists, formally approved my appointment as chairman of the Wilson Foundation. Some had already seen summaries. 2 had seen footage. None objected. When the final signature was placed, Patricia gathered the papers and said, "It's done." Harold stood slowly. "Now we finish it." The ballroom was full by 9 o'clock. 500 people beneath crystal chandeliers, champagne moving through the room on silver trays, laughter rising and falling in polished waves. Margaret stood near the center in a black gown, radiant, confident, touching arms, leaning into conversations, introducing Daniel with pride. Daniel looked transformed again, charming and bright, shaking hands with men he believed might fund his future. I watched them from the edge of the room, and the strangest feeling came over me. Not pleasure, not revenge, distance. They looked like people I had once known in a language I no longer spoke. Harold took the stage, and the room quieted immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice strong enough to fill the ballroom without effort. "Thank you for joining us at the 15th Annual Wilson Foundation Gala. For many years, this foundation has tried to honor one principle above all others. Wealth is not proof of character. It is a test of character." Polite applause followed. Margaret clapped enthusiastically, smiling as if she belonged to that sentence. Harold continued, "For the past 6 months, I have been conducting a private assessment regarding the future leadership of this foundation and the Wilson family estate. Tonight, I am pleased to announce that my grandson, Charles Wilson, has demonstrated the dignity, restraint, loyalty, and moral clarity required to carry this responsibility forward." A murmur moved through the room. I saw Margaret's smile flicker. Daniel's head turned. "Effective immediately," Harold said. "Charles Wilson will assume the role of chairman of the Wilson Foundation and will inherit control of Wilson Steel Industries and the Wilson family estate." The applause began uncertainly, then grew. Confusion rippled across faces as people recalculated relationships in real time. Margaret was not clapping now. Her face had gone still. Harold raised one hand, and the room quieted again. "Some of you know Margaret Johnson and Daniel Johnson. Some of you have been led to believe they were part of this family's future. I regret to inform you that through their own actions, documented clearly and repeatedly, they have forfeited any claim to the Wilson inheritance." The room changed. Not louder, sharper. Every head turned toward Margaret and Daniel. Margaret's mouth parted slightly. Daniel looked at her, then at Harold, then at me. "Over the past week," Harold continued, "they publicly abandoned Charles at Charles de Gaulle Airport without money, assistance, or concern. They then repeated their contempt in this hotel, declaring him merely a biological connection, stating that family loyalty should depend on wealth, status, and usefulness. I believe people should be judged by how they treat those they think have no power." He pressed a button on the podium. A screen descended. The airport footage began. Margaret's voice filled the ballroom. "You are not our responsibility anymore, Charles. Good luck getting home without money." Daniel's voice followed. "Maybe this will teach you to plan better." 500 people watched me standing alone at gate 42. Then the lobby footage played. Margaret's polished cruelty echoed through speakers designed for charity speeches and orchestral music. "You want unconditional love because you cannot earn conditional respect." Daniel's voice came next. "This is goodbye. For real this time." When the footage ended, the silence was complete. Harold returned to the microphone. "Margaret Johnson and Daniel Johnson are removed from all Wilson family trusts, all inheritance provisions, all foundation consideration, and all family privileges effective immediately. They are no longer welcome at Wilson Foundation events." Margaret made a sound then, small and strangled. "Harold, please," she called, stepping forward. "There is context." Harold looked at her with a coldness I had never seen in him before. "There always is. That was yours." Daniel tried next, voice cracking around panic. "Sir, this is a misunderstanding. We didn't know." Harold turned to him. "No, that is precisely the point. You did not know Charles mattered. You did not know anyone with power was watching. So you behaved according to your character. The applause did not begin immediately. It rose slowly, then thundered, not because people love justice as much as they claim, but because they understand power when it changes hands. Margaret and Daniel stood alone, as the room physically moved away from them. Conversations resumed around them, but not with them. Hands withdrew, eyes turned elsewhere. Social death happened with devastating politeness. 10 minutes later, in Harold's suite, Patricia placed documents before me. Transfer of Wilson Steel Industries. Appointment as foundation chairman. Deed to the family estate. Trust control. Charitable authority. Liquid assets totaling $340,612,437. Finally, the eviction notice for Margaret's house, financed through a Wilson family trust. My hand paused over that signature. Harold noticed. Charles, he said, you are not making her homeless. You are making her live on what she has actually earned. What has she earned? $23,000 a year at the gallery, Patricia said. Daniel makes $38,000 in marketing. Everything else was trust-supported. I signed. At midnight, their trust-linked cards froze. Sunday morning, Margaret tried to pay for breakfast, and her card declined. Then the backup declined. By the time their plane landed in Pittsburgh, their phones were full of automated notices. Mortgage payment declined. Merced's lease declined. Daniel's BMW payment declined. Credit facility suspended. Margaret called me Sunday evening from a voice I barely recognized. Smaller, thinner. Charles, she said, we need to talk. I was in my new office on the 47th floor of Wilson Steel Industries, looking out over Pittsburgh. About what? About what happened. Harold misunderstood. The videos were clear. People say things under stress. You said them calmly, she inhaled shakily. How much trouble are we in? There it was. Not apology. Assessment. Financially, I asked. Yes, that depends on what you've saved. Charles, the house payment is almost $5,000 a month. Then you'll need a different house. I've lived here 8 years. I lived in a studio apartment. You'll adjust. That's different. Yes, I said. I earned mine. Monday, her Mercedes was repossessed from the gallery parking lot in front of coworkers and customers. Daniel's BMW disappeared from his apartment complex before lunch. Tuesday, society pages mentioned their public disinheritance. Wednesday, Margaret's friends stopped returning calls. Thursday, Daniel's girlfriend ended things by text, saying his family situation was too unstable. Friday, the foreclosure process began. Within a month, Margaret and Daniel moved into a 2-bedroom apartment that cost $1,500 a month, half their combined take-home pay. Margaret sold jewelry for the deposit. Daniel learned what grocery prices looked like when no trust account absorbed them. 6 months later, Margaret called one final time. I was reviewing grant applications for the Wilson Foundation. A children's hospital needed $2 million for equipment. A literacy program needed funding. A homeless shelter needed winter expansion. Charles, she said, I understand now. What we did was wrong. I let the silence stretch. Daniel wants to apologize too. He's working full-time now, paying his own bills. He understands real life. Good. Is there any way back, she asked. Not to love, not to family. Back meant money. Back meant access. Back meant restoration. I looked at the grant file on my desk, at the photograph of a pediatric ward waiting for equipment that would keep children alive. You spent 3 years teaching me your rules, I said. People only deserve relationships if they bring value. Family is conditional. Respect belongs to whoever has wealth and status. We were wrong. Maybe. But those were your rules, Margaret. You chose them. You enforced them. Now you get to live by them. Her voice broke. So there's no way back. There is no way back to what we had. What we had was you tolerating me until you thought you could discard me without consequence. What about something new? I thought of Daniel as a little boy running toward me after baseball practice. I thought of him at the airport, telling me I was not his responsibility. Both were real. That was the cruelty of it. Some choices do not end relationships, I said. They reveal that the relationship was already gone. I hung up before she could answer. Then I approved the hospital grant, the literacy funding, and the shelter expansion. $15 million a year would go to people who needed help, people who knew the difference between dignity and status, people who understood that family is not proven in ballrooms or first-class cabins or expensive neighborhoods. But in the moment, someone is vulnerable, and you decide whether to protect them or leave them behind. Margaret and Daniel failed that test when they thought I had nothing. Harold made sure they paid for it when they learned I had everything. And the worst part for them was not losing the money. It was knowing they had revealed themselves before they knew the price.